Now, the DA has changed its tune on the declaration of state of disaster over the ongoing electricity crisis. The opposition party has been calling for this intervention for months, but are now going to court to challenge it. Last night at SONA, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the national state of disaster would be implemented with immediate effect and that it has already been gazetted to deal with the devastating blackouts. DA leader John Steenhuisen joins us now to explain why his party has changed its mind. Mr. Steenhuisen, we know that you've already taken the ANC to court in terms of cadre deployment, etc. They have been ordered to share some of their documents with your party. Is this the reason why you are reneging on saying that it should be declared a national state of disaster?
Well, I must just correct you. The DA's never called for a national state of disaster to deal with the electricity crisis. What we've called for is ring-fence state of disaster around Eskom specifically, to have specific interventions that would allow Eskom to have the yoke of some of the labour legislation, the procurement regulations, localisation requirements, and tariffs and taxes related to diesel lifted off their shoulders to enable them to deal with the crisis in the most effective manner. It would be completely improbable that we ever would have called for a national state of disaster, because, as I'm sure you are aware, we are currently in court challenging the constitutionality of the Disaster Management Act itself, in as far as it goes to calling national states of disaster.
And when it comes to the fact that we were put under a national state of disaster with immediate effect, were you surprised by this?
Well, I think it's completely unnecessary. I mean, obviously, the president has been talking about it for a week, and we've been making the point that it's not necessary. And what you are going to now do is risk the floodgates opening for the same mass corruption, looting, and abuse of power and lack of parliamentary oversight that we saw during the COVID-19 period, which is precisely why we're in the courts challenging the constitutionality of the Disaster Management Act insofar as it removes those oversight mechanisms. And we're obviously awaiting a court date for that. But obviously this new announcement, I think, is a gimmick by government to look like they're doing something in the crisis, when in fact it's all it's going to do is open those floodgates for more corruption and maladministration.
So you're taking the government to court, or the governing party to court, in terms of declaring this national state of disaster. When do we expect arguments to take place, and what will you be presenting in your arguments to court?
Well, we are already in court on the constitutionality of the section, because as a state of emergency, for instance, requires a parliamentary consent, and that's a much higher level of intervention. We believe that there should be parliamentary consent, or at least some reference to Parliament, before declaring national states of disaster, because essentially what it does is removes all oversight mechanisms of Parliament, and we saw what happened there. So that's already before the courts, and we're awaiting a court date for that. We will obviously look at challenging now this declaration of a national state of disaster, because it's not justified when you have a isolated industry or body like Eskom, where focused interventions around Eskom itself make far more sense to be able to get to the bottom of the problem and get electricity back into the grid and back into our homes and back into our economy.
And Mr. Steenhuisen, what was your reaction when you heard that soon we'll have a Minister of Electricity in the presidency?
I mean, I would find it funny if it wasn't so tragic. Part of the problem we have is that we've got too many politicians, ruining the broth already with Eskom. You've got two ministers who, for the last decade, have made no impact whatsoever in getting us out of load shedding. In fact, their ideological bent and their clinging to that failed ideology is part of the reason why we're in the terrible state we're in at the moment. Adding now another minister, a third minister, into the mix is not going to solve the problem. What the president should have announced last night is he's getting the politicians out of the room, and he's going to appoint energy experts and then free them up from the regulations that are tying them down from being able to get us from a point of energy insecurity to getting energy back into the grid and giving power back to the people of South Africa.
And this also is something different to a president who said that he would make his cabinet smaller when he came in as president back in 2017, only for us to find out that we're having a new minister coming into his cabinet now.
Correct. And there's obviously a whole cost associated with that and that office. But it's a bigger problem. We've got a president who's now drawing up into his own office the work of the cabinet and essentially establishing a parallel cabinet within his own office. He's already usurped the powers of the State Security Agency, which was a terrible idea. He's got the red tape unit in his office now. He's got climate change in his office now. He's taking on all these powers, and Parliament has no oversight over those because there's no parliamentary committee that exercises oversight of the presidency. And it is very, very dangerous in a democracy to consolidate so much power in a single office and then not have the requisite oversight to ensure that things are being done properly.
And that's exactly what I was going to ask you in terms of centralizing all the power in the presidency. You mentioned SSA, for instance, now the Minister of Electricity, etc. But also the president has announced a lot of committees. There's a crisis committee into the electricity crisis as well. A lot of people are saying we cannot run a country only from the president's office with a parallel cabinet, plus also have a country that is run on committees and advisory panels.
Yes, and it also is very problematic because you have these now fundamental contradictions that are taking place in government. Those inherent contradictions are, for instance, between Mr. Mantashe, what he's saying, and what the energy advisors in the president's office are saying, and two fundamentally mixed messages are going out there. So who must the market understand? Who must energy role players believe when Mr. Mantashe says we're going to solve the electricity problem in 6 months, and energy experts are saying, well, according to the president's own plan, load shedding's with us till at least the second and third quarters of 2024. So it really creates this bogged down, overly bureaucratic system when what we should be doing is getting all of that out the way and moving as rapidly as we can from point A to point B of energy insecurity to energy security. And only energy experts, locally and internationally, leveraging the power of the private sector and entrepreneurship is going to get us out of this mess. That's how the other 110 countries that opened up the energy market were able to get through this. And it doesn't make sense that we're doubling down essentially on more bureaucracy, more political interference, and more ideology, rather than freeing all that up to be able to release energy into the grid.
Are you feeling positive at all at the fact that he also mentioned that IPPs would be giving about 2,800 megawatts of power soon, that they've started building? He also mentioned that government will be rolling out solar panels to different homes, etc., so that people can also try and get their own power. Do you feel positive about that, or are you skeptical of the implementation?
I'm positive about it, and I think it's, I think he used the words last night, better late than never. It would have been great if we'd been doing these things in 2015 when we were warned what was coming down the road with the energy crisis, and Eskom and government were warned about when we would hit the stage 4, 6 rolling blackouts, and nothing was done. We didn't move then on independent power producers and on all these interventions. That being said, the sooner we can move to energy independence, the better it'll be. The more we can empower residents and businesses to be able to generate their own power and feed it back into the grid to release some of the burden, the better. So those, along with, I think, the infrastructure announcements that were made last night, were steps in the right direction and positive.
Right, Mr. Steenhuisen, before I let you go, you raised a point of order yesterday after the chaotic scenes with the EFF approaching the stage, etc., and Parliament security was then brought in. At the end of the event yesterday, after the president was done, the National Assembly Speaker then tried to explain to you why she took that decision. She said it was to protect everyone who was in the City Hall. Are you satisfied with her explanation in terms of her decision to bring security in?
Well, let me start by saying I think the behavior of the EFF last night was abhorrent and has no place in a democracy. And they well deserve to be thrown out for that behavior. That being said, we have an independent parliamentary protection service that is supposed to intervene, not the security service of the state, and certainly not armed members coming into the chamber to move people. I would advance that far more danger existed, that one of those firearms could well have been manhandled during a scuffle, and we could have had bullets flying around that particular hall last night. We have that parliamentary protection services there, and who are unarmed and are there to shepherd MPs out when they need to be taken out, precisely because there has to be a separation of powers. It's a parliamentary tradition that dates back to the very first parliament, where the king was prevented from marching troops into parliament to remove members of parliament that were saying things that he didn't particularly like. So it is a fundamental parliamentary tradition. And so I think that there will be a review of the process and we will have a look at it. But I think that the Speaker did not authorize, as she said she did, the security services to come in when she said she did. And I think it is problematic. We've already been through the courts all the way up to the Constitutional Court on whether armed members of the SAPS could come into the chamber. And that's what led to the establishment of Parliament's own Parliamentary Protection Service to prevent that from happening. I think last night's events were unfortunate. I think the EFF's behaviour was terrible. But if we're going to uphold the law and the rules of Parliament, it must be done consistently, and especially by those responsible for interpreting and applying those rules.
All right, leader of the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance, Mr. John Steenhuisen, thank you very much for your time.